So what about those earlier periods? And we really, as a touchstone, again, certainly in the Christian West, we need to go back to Augustine again and even look back at a part of one of the texts that we looked at as a primary source text a couple of weeks ago. Now we're looking at Augustine and part of the City of God. This is a fundamentally important text in political theology. We just don't have time in this class to talk a lot about the Christian East. Again, if you take a church history course, if you take my church history course, we spend a lot of time talking about these early centuries of Christendom and the fact that the Eastern Church and the Western Church relatively early on began to develop some of their own styles, some of their own thought process, and they were related to different political centers. The church in the West was related to Rome as an ecclesial and political center, and the church in the East was related to Byzantium as its political and ecclesial center. And those political differences in the early centuries of Christendom, there's sort of an ebb and flow between those political centers. There are even some times when is fighting, literal fighting between those centers. At one point during the Crusades, so there's a lot of tension. In 1054, there is the Great Schism when the Eastern Church separates from the Western Church. I mentioned the Crusades just a moment ago. Kind of in this period before the Great Schism, the various crusades are going on. The wars with Islamic forces and the rise of Islam in the further parts of the East, but impinging on the eastern part of Christendom, begin to really even further geographically and politically isolate the East and West. So there's an important traditions of political theology and thoughts about the state in the East. We could talk about the Emperor Justinian, for example, but we just don't have that much time to consider that. So we're going to focus mostly on the Augustinian legacy as our text does. So recall that we looked at an excerpt from Augustine's City of God, and this Augustinian definition of society: an assemblage of reasonable beings bound together by a common agreement concerning the objects of their love. And Augustine here is talking probably more broadly about what we today would call society, but he also is talking about elements of what we today would call state. Remember that in Augustine's kind of political view, there's not a sharp contrast between society and state. State governance, political governance, temporal governance, kind of falls into this general question of society. Remember for Augustine that there's this city of man, this kind of current reality that we inhabit that is passing away and that is corrupted. And then there is the city of God, which is the coming reign of God, but which is already present in some way, and which isn't fully known, but which sort of co-inhabits the space right now with the city of man. So that's Augustine's kind of concept of how political order is relating to spiritual order and his broad definition of society. And the book mentions John Henry Newman, Cardinal Newman, and I have a little picture of him down here. And I think the reason that the text emphasizes Newman is because thought like Newman's, like this, and this is from the 19th century, but thought like this still remains very, very influential and important in wide varieties of political theologies, whatever direction they might take. And we might even say that there's kind of a broadly Augustinian tradition in political theology and then also in theological ethics that draws on concepts like this when it's thinking about how the spiritual order relates to the temporal order and how Christians ought to think about living in the world today. So notice Newman's definition here: a certain assemblage of beliefs, convictions, rules, usages, traditions, proverbs, and principles, some political, some social, some moral, and these tending towards some definite form of government and modus vivendi, way of living, or polity as their natural scope. This, then, is the constitution of the state, securing as it does the national unity. So notice his definition isn't first about some kind of power that is imposed and that, sets rules that, could just be any old kind of rule. What he's suggesting is that from the corporate body of the people, the way that people live, the way that people speak, the things that people believe, all of that tends toward a way in which it makes sense, that it naturally makes sense for those people to be governed. And what the state does is reflect those values and secure those basic values. Now, Newman, writing as a British Catholic, he had been a British Anglican and then a British Catholic, I think you could gather from this a certain sense of the kind of British understanding of themselves, even in the 19th century. But even today, I think you'll see political theologians, again, like John Milbank, resonating with this kind of thing. In the American context, people who are Augustinian political theologians might refer more toward our constitutional tradition, whereas people in the British tradition might refer a little bit more toward how some of their social conventions cohere in a constitutional monarchy. But either way, right, the notion is there is this society that comes first, and from the society flows naturally the political authority. And notice also that the sense here is that if the society is rotten to begin with, then the political authority is going to be rotten. If the society has certain things in it that are worth preserving, then there are going to be things in the political authority that are valuable and even good, and that it's important to have preserved. So kind of how you think of what the political authority does is going to be important to this concept of what you think society is.